Imagine waking up tomorrow and your job is gone. Money doesn't exist. Your boss doesn't exist. The concept of a Monday doesn't exist. There's no alarm, no email, no meetings, no one asking you to circle back or touch base or hop on a quick call. What do? If your first instinct is, I'd finally be free, congratulations. You just had the exact same thought that literally every human being had for about 300,000 years. Because for most of human history, this was just Tuesday. Or whatever they called Tuesday. Probably nothing. They didn't have Tuesdays either. They didn't have weeks. The whole concept of dividing time into 7-day chunks so you could dread 5 of them and barely enjoy 2 is a remarkably recent human invention. And honestly, one of our worst. So here's the question that should genuinely keep you up at night. What did ancient humans actually do all day? Like hour by hour, dawn to dusk? When there was no job to go to, no Netflix to watch, no phone to doom scroll, no newsletter to unsubscribe from. What was a normal day in the life of a prehistoric human? The answer is equal parts surprising, fascinating, and honestly a little bit embarrassing for us. Because it turns out the people we spent centuries calling primitive were, in several important ways, living better than most of us are right now. And I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because the evidence is genuinely overwhelming once you start looking. So let's look. The biggest lie we've been told about prehistoric life is that it was basically a non-stop survival horror game. Ancient human wakes up. Ancient human tries not to get eaten. Ancient human grunts at something. Ancient human fails to invent agriculture. Ancient human dies at 30. That's wrong. Almost completely wrong. And the reason we believed it for so long is actually kind of funny. It's because we looked at the hard evidence of ancient life and drew conclusions. We found bones with cut marks. We found weapons. We found the remains of animals they'd hunted and butchered. And we went, ah yes, brutal survival. All day, every day. But here's the thing. We also found cave paintings. We found musical instruments made from bird bones and mammoth ivory dating back 40,000 years. We found jewelry made from shells, from teeth, from carefully perforated stones strung together as necklaces. We found evidence of people traveling hundreds of miles, on foot, across landscapes with no roads, no maps, no Uber, just to trade pigments for body paint. We found graves where elderly people who had survived decades with crippling physical disabilities were buried with care, with ceremony, sometimes surrounded by flowers. That's not the behavior of a species spending every waking moment in survival panic. That's the behavior of a species that had time on their hands. A lot of it, and was doing genuinely interesting things with that time. The survival horror narrative isn't just inaccurate, it's almost the opposite of the truth. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Marshall Solins did something that was considered fairly radical at the time. He actually studied modern hunter-gatherer groups with rigorous attention to their time use, trying to understand what daily life might have looked like before agriculture fundamentally reorganized human existence. He looked at the Hashish Kungsan people of southern Africa's Kalahari Desert, the Hadza of Tanzania, Aboriginal groups in Australia, societies that had maintained versions of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle into the modern era. And what he found destroyed the dominant narrative almost entirely. On average, these groups spent somewhere between 3 and 5 hours a day on what you could call subsistence work. Hunting, gathering, preparing food, maintaining tools, building or maintaining shelter. 3 to 5 hours per day. The rest of the time, genuinely, legitimately free. Talking, resting, sleeping, playing games, making music, making art, making tools they didn't immediately need, telling stories, engaging in the complex social rituals of group life. Solins called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Not because they had a lot of stuff, they had almost nothing in terms of material possessions, and deliberately so because everything you own is something you have to carry. But because they had the one thing that every modern human is desperately chasing and almost never successfully catches. Time. Abundant, unscheduled, unmonetized, genuinely free time. Now compare that to the average contemporary adult who, between their job, their commute, their administrative tasks, their childcare responsibilities, and the general exhausting overhead of maintaining a modern life, has approximately 2.5 to 3 hours of genuine leisure per day, if they're lucky. And most of that leisure is spent staring at a screen, consuming content algorithmically optimized to make them anxious enough to keep watching. We are working more hours, with more stress, with less rest, than people who were hunting animals with sticks. Let that sit with you for a second. Let's break it down, because this is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. They talked, constantly and expertly. If you could go back in time and observe a group of hunter-gatherers sitting around a fire in the late afternoon, the most striking thing wouldn't be the fire, or the animal skins, or the stone tools, or the absence of Wi-Fi. It would be the conversation, because ancient humans were relentless, dedicated, passionate talkers. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups have consistently shown that a massive portion of their non-work time, potentially 60 to 70% of all social time, was spent in conversation. And not just tactical conversation, not just the mammoth migration patterns this season seem different, or I think the river runs south from here. They gossiped, they told jokes, they argued, they flirted, they complained about each other. They shared stories about things that happened years ago. They speculated about things they couldn't explain. Robin Dunbar, the British anthropologist famous for Dunbar's number, the theory that humans can comfortably maintain about 150 stable social relationships before the cognitive load becomes unmanageable, argued compellingly that language itself evolved primarily as a form of social grooming, because other primates maintain social bonds by physically grooming each other, picking parasites and debris out of each other's fur. It's time-consuming and intimate, and it builds trust and alliance. But as human social groups grew larger and more complex, you simply couldn't physically groom 80 people. There weren't enough hours. So humans evolved language to achieve the same social bonding function at scale. You can verbally groom many people at once. Sitting around a fire talking to 5 people simultaneously maintains 5 relationships in the time it used to take to maintain 1. Gossip in this framework is not a character flaw. It is the original social technology, the fundamental software of human community, which means that every time you call a friend just to chat about nothing or gossip with a coworker about something silly, or spend an evening doing nothing but talking and laughing with people you love, you are doing exactly what your ancestors did around a fire 50,000 years ago. You are not wasting time, you are performing the oldest and most essential human activity there is. Here's something that genuinely freaks people out when they learn it. The concept of sleeping for 8 consecutive hours at night is almost certainly a modern invention, not something humans evolved to do, not even something humans historically did, something we were essentially forced into by artificial lighting and the factory schedule. Historian Roger E. Kirch spent over 2 decades researching sleep patterns in historical documents, diaries, medical texts, court records, literature, and found overwhelming evidence that before the widespread introduction of artificial lighting, most people slept in 2 distinct phases. First sleep, from roughly dusk until sometime around midnight. Then a period of being awake, genuinely, naturally awake, not insomnia, for 1 to 2 hours. Then, second sleep until dawn. During that middle-of-the-night waking period, people didn't lie there in anguished insomnia, wishing they could get back to sleep. They got up, they talked with their families, they prayed or meditated. They had sex, they smoked pipes, they visited neighbors, they checked on their animals. Some used it for reflection and creative thought. There are accounts of people deliberately using this period for problem-solving, for writing, or the kind of deep thinking that the busy daytime hours didn't allow. Ancient and medieval texts are casually full of references to first sleep and second sleep, as if these terms needed no explanation. Because they didn't. Everyone knew what they meant because everyone experienced it. It was only after gaslighting in the early 19th century and then electric lighting in the late 19th century made the night fully artificial and conquerable that this natural sleep pattern got compressed and flattened into the consolidated 8-hour block we now consider biologically normal. It's not. Or at least, it may not be. If you sometimes wake up at 2 a.m., lie there for an hour feeling oddly alert and calm and wonder what's wrong with you, the answer is potentially nothing. Your body is doing what human bodies did for hundreds of thousands of years. You're just missing the campfire, the low voices of your family nearby, and the absolute spectacular darkness of a world without electric lights. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about prehistoric humans is the idea that they were technologically rudimentary. That Stone Age implies something crude and simple, but the craftsmanship required to produce their tools, their clothing, their shelter, and their art was not simple. It was demanding, practiced, skilled work that took years to master. Take stone knapping, the process of shaping flint or obsidian by striking it in precise sequences to produce a blade with a sharp, consistent edge. This sounds like something anyone could do with a rock. It is not. The material has specific fracture properties that have to be deeply understood and anticipated. The angle, force, and location of each strike must be carefully controlled. A single wrong blow can shatter the whole piece. Modern archaeologists and enthusiasts who have tried to learn knapping have reported that genuine proficiency takes years of regular practice. Ancient humans spent significant portions of their time developing and maintaining this skill. Then there's clothing production in cold climates, which was an enormous undertaking. Preparing animal hides to be worn required scraping them clean, treating them to prevent hardening and decay, and then stitching them into garments using bone needles. We have found needles made of bone dating back 50,000 years or more. Needles with eyes that someone sat down and carefully drilled through a tiny piece of bone using stone tools because they wanted to sew. Because the quality of their stitching mattered to them. Because they cared, and then there's the art, which should make every single person stop and feel something. The cave paintings at Lascaux in France were made approximately 17,000 years ago. The ones at Chauvet-Pont d'Arc are potentially 36,000 years old. These are not crude scribbles. These are sophisticated, dynamic, compositionally thoughtful representations of animals. Horses mid-gallop, bison turning their heads, charging rhinoceroses, lions hunting in packs. They demonstrate an understanding of movement, of perspective, of light and shadow that genuinely astonishes contemporary artists and illustrators who study them. Some of the artists use the natural curves and protrusions of the cave walls to give their animals three-dimensional form, so that when viewed by flickering firelight, the only light available to them, the horses and bison and aurochs would appear to breathe, to shift, to move. They built cinematic illusion into stone walls in the dark 36,000 years ago. That is not primitive. That is breathtaking. And it means someone stood in that cave or crouched or lay on their back on the rock floor, probably for hours doing this work. Not because they had to, not because it fed anyone, because they had something to say, and they found a way to say it in a medium that would outlast everything else they ever touched by tens of thousands of years. If there's a definition of art, that's it. They played. Seriously and enthusiastically. Because of course they did. Because play is not a modern luxury. Play is one of the defining behaviors of intelligent social species. Crows play, dolphins play, wolves play, and humans, who are all of those things at once plus much more, play constantly and elaborately. We have evidence of board games going back to the earliest civilizations. The royal game of Ur, found in ancient Mesopotamia, dates to around 2500 BCE, and its rules have been partially reconstructed from a Babylonian clay tablet. But organized games almost certainly predate any civilization. Children in every hunter-gatherer society ever studied engage in rich, complex play, mimicking adult skills, inventing rules and games, competing, cooperating, negotiating. This is universal across all human cultures that have ever been observed, and universality in human behavior almost always signals deep evolutionary roots. Wrestling competitions, foot races, tests of throwing accuracy, these appear independently in ancient cultures worldwide, in groups with no contact with each other, which is very strong evidence that competitive play is simply something humans do naturally when they have the time and energy to do it, which ancient humans, with their 3 to 5 hour workday, very much did. Play is also, it's worth noting, one of the primary mechanisms through which children develop physical skills, social skills, and emotional intelligence. The line between play and education in ancient societies was essentially non-existent. You learned to hunt by playing at hunting. You learned social negotiation by playing games with high stakes and real conflict. You learned to manage your emotions under pressure by competing and sometimes losing. Ancient children weren't in school. They were in the world, and the world was their teacher. They took extraordinary care of each other. This is the detail that hits the hardest and the one that gets the least attention in popular narratives about ancient humans. We have found skeletons of ancient individuals who had severe, lifelong disabilities, conditions that would have made them completely unable to contribute to group survival in any conventional physical sense. And yet they survived. For years. For decades. Because someone took care of them. A Neanderthal discovered at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, known as Shanidar I, had a withered and amputated right arm, was partially blind in his left eye, had significant hearing loss, and had suffered and survived serious leg injuries. He was around 40 years old at death, which was genuinely old for the time. He could not have hunted. He could not have gathered effectively. He would have been, by any ruthless calculus of pure survival efficiency, a liability. And yet his group fed him, protected him, and kept him alive for years, not because they had to, because they chose to. We found the skull of a child with Down syndrome who lived in what is now Spain and died approximately 500,000 years ago, having survived to around 8 years of age. The level of care required to keep a child with significant developmental disabilities alive in that environment for 8 years goes enormously beyond what simple survival instinct would demand. Someone loved that child enough to make it happen. We found evidence of healed fractures in ancient skeletons. Healed, which means the person survived long enough for the bone to knit back together, which means they were fed and protected during weeks or months of incapacitation. Someone sat with them, brought them food, kept the fire going. Ancient humans buried their dead with intention, with arrangement, with grave goods, with apparent ceremony. They mourned, they remembered. They marked the end of a life as something that mattered. The bones of ancient people don't tell a story of brutal indifference. They tell a story of communities that took care of each other in ways that cost them real resources and real effort, for no strategic reason whatsoever except that this is what it means to be human. And yes, they also hunted. And it was completely insane. We can't do this entire video without properly addressing the hunting because it was genuinely one of the most extraordinary physical achievements in the natural world. Before the development of bow and arrow technology, which appears around 70,000 years ago in South Africa, and considerably later in other parts of the world, humans hunted primarily with spears and with a strategy that sounds, when you first hear it, like a joke. It's called persistence hunting, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You find an animal, something large, a kudu, a wildebeest, a deer, and then you follow it, not sprinting after it, not trying to outrun it, because you can't outrun a wildebeest in a sprint. You just keep pace. You track it. You follow it at a jog through the midday heat, through the hottest part of the day, for hours. Every time it tries to rest, because most four-legged animals cool down by panting, and panting requires them to stop moving, you appear again on the horizon, and it panics and runs again. And you follow, again, for 5 hours, 8 hours, sometimes longer, until the animal is so thermally exhausted, so overheated, so physiologically depleted, that it literally collapses and cannot rise. And you walk up to it calmly and finish the job. This works because humans sweat. We are one of the only mammals on Earth that primarily cools our bodies through perspiration rather than panting, which means we can sustain movement in heat that incapacitates almost everything else. Our peculiar, hairless, sweating, flat-footed, large-buttocked bodies were specifically shaped by evolution for long-distance running in hot conditions. The gluteus maximus, the muscle that makes up most of your backside, is enormous in humans compared to other primates. Not because we sit a lot, because we run. It's a running muscle. We evolved it for exactly this purpose. Those weird flat feet, running adaptations, our relatively long legs compared to our trunk, running adaptations. The way our heads balance on our spines with remarkably little muscular effort so they don't bob violently when we run, running adaptation. The fact that we can breathe independently of our stride, unlike most quadrupeds who have to breathe in sync with their gait. Running adaptation. We were built from the bones outward to be endurance predators, long-distance pursuit hunters, the most improbable and effective ones on Earth. When you run a half marathon and question your life choices around mile 9, you are using hardware engineered over millions of years of evolution, specifically to chase large animals across open landscapes in the heat of midday. You were made for this. Your ancestors were terrifyingly good at it. What about genuine downtime? True rest. Here's something nobody expects. Ancient humans were probably substantially better at actually resting than modern humans are. Not just sleeping more or sleeping differently, genuinely resting, cognitively, emotionally, in ways that modern people have largely lost the ability to do. Neuroscience has established something called the default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate specifically when you're not focused on any external task, when your attention is unfocused and inwardly directed. This network is associated with daydreaming, self-reflection, creative thought, emotional processing, and what researchers call mental time travel, the ability to simulate past events and imagine future scenarios. It's extraordinarily important for psychological health and for creativity. And here's the problem. The default mode network requires genuine cognitive rest to activate properly. Your brain has to actually stop processing external stimulation. But modern humans fill essentially every quiet moment with input: a podcast, a scroll, something to watch, something to read, a notification to check. We have collectively, accidentally engineered an environment in which genuine cognitive rest is almost impossible to achieve without deliberate effort. Ancient humans didn't have this problem. Sitting by a fire after dark, watching the flames, not doing anything in particular, letting thoughts arise and dissolve without any agenda, this was normal. It was the default evening activity for most of human history. And it probably had profound benefits for mental health, emotional regulation, creative processing, and the kind of unconscious problem solving that the brain does when you give it space. There's a reason so many of humanity's great leaps, in art, in philosophy, in mathematics, in technology, seem to cluster in periods and places of relative stillness and contemplation. The mind, when genuinely not occupied, does extraordinary things. Ancient people knew this, not as neuroscience but as lived experience. They were sitting with their own thoughts for hours every single day, noticing things, making connections, asking questions that had no obvious answers. The stories they told around the fire about those questions, about why the stars moved, about where the dead went, about what the animals meant, about how the world was made. Those stories are the ancestors of science, of philosophy, of religion, of literature. They came from minds with time to wander. So I have one last question for you. Would you want to go back? Let me know in the comments. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon. It's roughly 170,000 years ago. You're a human, barely recognizable as one, but still. You wake up, stretch, look around at the African savanna, and at absolutely no point do you think you know what would really complete this morning. Pants. And yet, here we are. Billions of people every single morning putting on pants, or skirts, or whatever you call that thing that's technically pajamas but you've been wearing for 3 days straight and you're calling it loungewear now because that sounds intentional. Clothes are so baked into human existence that we literally arrest people for not wearing them. Think about that for a second. The state will intervene if you're too naked. We built an entire legal system around the concept of please, put something on. We have laws about nudity as a species. That is where we are. But why? When did this start? And more importantly, why did we do it when basically every other animal on the planet just didn't? Dogs don't wear clothes. Wolves don't wear clothes. The elephant, which is objectively smarter than most people you went to high school with, has never once thought, I need a jacket for this. The short answer is, we have no idea exactly when it happened. The long answer is way more interesting and slightly weird, and it involves lice, which, spoiler, is not as gross as it sounds. Actually, it is. It's exactly as gross as it sounds. But stick with it, because the lice thing is genuinely one of the most bizarre and fascinating pieces of evolutionary detective work in all of science. Let's go back to the beginning. The naked ape problem. Here's something nobody talks about enough. Humans are basically the only large mammals on Earth that are nearly hairless. Genuinely stop and think about that zoologically for a second. Gorillas? Covered. Chimpanzees? Covered. Bears, lions, wolves, horses, elephants, hippos, all of them across wildly different environments and climates are walking around in full coats. And then there's us, standing in the middle of all this biodiversity, just smooth, a bit patchy, weirdly pink in some places, sporting an evolutionary look that says, I used to have fur, but I made some choices. Scientists have a few theories for why we lost our fur in the first place. The most popular one is the thermoregulation argument. Basically, as our ancestors moved from forests to open grasslands and started running long distances to hunt, being covered in thick fur became a massive liability. You'd overheat, you'd slow down, your core temperature would spike, and you'd collapse before catching the thing you were chasing, and then you'd die hungry, which from an evolutionary perspective is the worst possible outcome. So over hundreds of thousands of years, we gradually shed our fur and developed something better, an absolutely insane number of sweat glands. Humans have approximately 2 to 4 million sweat glands on their bodies. That is more than almost any other animal on the planet. We are, without exaggeration, elite sweating machines. Professional grade, world-class moisture emitters. If there were Olympics for sweating, we would dominate every category. This is great in the summer. It is considerably less great when it's 40 below zero and you're trying to survive in Central Asia with nothing but your wits and a rock. And that's where clothes come in, eventually. Warmth was probably not the first reason. Probably. Here's the conventional story. Humans moved out of Africa, hit colder climates, got cold, wrapped themselves in animal skins, and that's that. Simple, clean, logical. A 5-year-old could figure it out. Except the timeline doesn't quite work, and once you notice that, the whole tidy narrative starts to unravel. Genetic evidence, which we'll get to in about 30 seconds, suggests that humans started wearing clothes somewhere around 100,000 to 170,000 years ago. The problem is that modern humans didn't really start migrating out of Africa in significant numbers until around 70,000 years ago. So if clothes were purely a response to cold weather, why are they appearing tens of thousands of years before humans actually went anywhere cold? Something else must have been going on earlier. Something social. Something that has more to do with who we are as a species than with the temperature outside. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the most unlikely piece of evidence in the entire clothing origin story. And yes, it's the lice. We're doing the lice now. The louse that changed everything. Researchers at the University of Florida were doing what geneticists do, which apparently involves staring at very small things for extremely long periods of time and occasionally having a breakthrough that changes everything. And they decided to map the evolutionary history of human lice. Now, here's the crucial piece of biology you need to understand. Humans have two main types of lice: head lice and body lice. Head lice live in your hair. Body lice live specifically in clothing, in the seams, in the folds, in the fabric. They are two genetically distinct populations, and body lice evolved from head lice at some specific moment in history. Here's why that matters enormously. Body lice can only survive if there are clothes to live in. They cannot survive on bare human skin. They need fabric. They need the warmth and shelter that clothing provides. So the moment body lice genetically diverged from head lice, the moment that evolutionary split happened, is essentially the moment humans started wearing clothes consistently enough to create a new ecological niche for a parasite. When researchers ran the numbers, they found that body lice diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Let that sit for a moment. A parasitic insect, one of the most universally hated creatures in human history, the thing that causes mass panic in elementary schools and ruins camping trips, accidentally preserved the earliest evidence of human fashion. The lice know when we got dressed before we do. They were there. They adapted, they moved in. That is either beautiful or deeply, deeply horrifying. Possibly both simultaneously, probably both. So, what were clothes actually for first? Okay, so we've established that clothing predates the migration out of Africa by a significant margin, which means warmth cannot be the original driver. So, what was? Theory number 1. Basic physical protection. Not from cold, but from sun. insects, sharp vegetation, and general abrasion. If you're spending your days walking through tall grass and thorny scrubland, tracking animals across rocky terrain, a basic wrap or loincloth made from animal hide creates a meaningful barrier between your skin and things that want to scratch, bite, or burn it. It's not glamorous, it's not philosophically interesting, but it probably kept early humans significantly more comfortable and reduced infections from small cuts and wounds. Sometimes the boring answer is the right one. Theory number 2 is where it gets genuinely interesting: social signaling. Humans are, at our core, profoundly social animals. We are obsessed with hierarchy in a way that goes bone deep. We are constantly, compulsively communicating who we are, what group we belong to, what status we hold, whether you should be scared of us, or attracted to us, or deferential to us. We do this with our posture, our facial expressions, our voices, our hairstyles, our tattoos, and quite possibly from very early on, with what we drape over our bodies. There's evidence that our ancestors were using pigments like ochre for body decoration as far back as 200,000 years ago. That's before the lice evidence for clothing, so the impulse to decorate the body to signal something visually about yourself to the group, that may actually be older than clothing itself. We were painting ourselves before we were dressing ourselves. The jump from decorating your skin to wearing a particular kind of hide in a particular way isn't a large cognitive leap, and once the hide is on, you start thinking about which hide, and how it's worn, and what that communicates. Is this the hide of something powerful? Did I kill it myself? Does wearing it say something about me? Welcome to the very first fashion industry. Population: a small band of Homo sapiens on the African savanna, arguing about who gets to wear the leopard skin. Needles, awls, and the invention of tailoring. For most of early human history, clothing probably looked rough. A skin draped over the shoulders, held in place with a cord made of twisted sinew, maybe crudely cut along the edges with a stone flake. Functional, ungainly. The prehistoric equivalent of wearing a bin bag. Gets the job done, but nobody's winning any awards. But then, around 50,000 years ago, something changes in the archaeological record. Researchers start finding bone needles, not just pointed tools for punching holes, actual needles with tiny eyes bored through them, clearly designed for threading sinew or fiber and stitching material together with precision. Fitted clothing, sewn seams, garments shaped to the body rather than just thrown over it. The oldest confirmed needle with a proper eye was found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, and dates back approximately 50,000 years. It was made from the hollow bone of a bird, shaped and polished to a fineness that is genuinely extraordinary. This object represents a cognitive leap that is difficult to overstate. Someone looked at a sliver of bone, envisioned a tool that didn't yet exist, figured out how to bore a clean hole through the narrow end without splitting it, and used the finished product to join two pieces of material with a controlled, repeatable stitch. That is not survival instinct. That is engineering. That is design thinking. That is someone solving a problem through imagination and craft rather than brute force. And that needle matters more than almost any other object from that period. Because you can live without pottery, you can live without cave paintings. In Siberia, 50,000 years ago, in the depths of a glacial winter, without properly fitted clothing that seals heat against the body? You absolutely cannot. The Neanderthals were doing it, too. Here's something that often gets dropped from the clothing origin story, mostly because it complicates the neat modern humans invented everything narrative. Neanderthals were also making and wearing clothes, and they were doing it well before they ever encountered us. We've found substantial evidence of Neanderthals systematically processing animal hides, scraping bones in patterns consistent with hide preparation, using specific stone tools that were clearly designed for working leather, and managing carcasses in ways that suggest they were after the skin as much as the meat. There's also genetic and anatomical evidence suggesting Neanderthals had physiological adaptations to cold climates, stockier bodies, shorter limbs, different fat distribution, which tells us they were dealing with serious cold for a very long time. Clothes would have been essential, not optional. And then there are the Denisovans, the mysterious third human lineage we only discovered in 2010 from a single finger bone found in that same Siberian cave. In the same archaeological layers as the needle, researchers found pierced and polished ornaments that suggest symbolic thinking, decoration, and possibly garment embellishment. A people we barely know existed were already thinking about what they were wearing and how it looked. So the impulse to clothe the body wasn't exclusive to our lineage. Multiple human species in different environments arrived at similar solutions through overlapping reasoning, which raises a genuinely unsettling question. Is clothing a human thing, or is it a smart bipedal primate living in a harsh environment thing? Is it inevitable? Would any sufficiently intelligent creature, cold enough and social enough, eventually figure out that wrapping yourself in something is just obviously correct? We don't know, but the convergence across species is very hard to dismiss. Let's take a step back and talk about the truly strange thing here. The thing that separates human clothing from every other animal's relationship with shelter or protection. If clothes were purely practical, every culture across history would converge on the most thermally efficient solution for their climate and just stay there forever. Thick hides in the Arctic, light plant fiber in the tropics, same shapes, same function, total standardization. Done. That is categorically not what happened. What happened is that humans immediately and universally made clothing mean something. In every culture we have records of, going back to the earliest archaeological evidence, clothing carries symbolic weight that goes far beyond its physical function. Priests wore different things than warriors. Rulers wore things nobody else was allowed to wear. The dead were buried in specific garments suited to their status and the journey ahead of them. Ceremonies required specific dress that would be absurd in any other context. Some of the oldest textile fragments ever found weren't just pieces of fabric. They were dyed in multiple colors. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, looked at a perfectly functional piece of woven material and thought, this needs to be a different color. Not because it would keep them warmer, but because it would mean something different. Because it would say something. This is the fundamental weirdness of human clothing. We use it as language. We use it to construct and broadcast identity. We use it to say, I belong to this group, I hold this rank, I am mourning, I am celebrating, I am dangerous, I am available, I am sacred, I am ordinary. No other animal does this. Peacocks display, sure. Cuttlefish change color, but they're not choosing what to communicate based on social context, cultural history, and personal narrative. That's entirely ours. And it started, as best we can tell, in Africa between 1 and 200,000 years ago, when some ancestor of ours picked up a piece of ochre, painted themselves with it, and felt something click into place about who they were in relation to everyone else. Even if warmth wasn't the original reason, it became a survival-critical one fast. Between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, Earth went through a series of brutal glacial cycles. Global temperatures plunged, ice sheets expanded dramatically. Large portions of Africa became hyper-arid. Lakes dried up. Food sources collapsed. The human population may have crashed to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 individuals at its lowest point. We nearly went extinct. We came astonishingly close to just not existing anymore, as a species, before we'd even gotten properly started. For the survivors, and especially for the groups that eventually pushed north into Europe and east into Central Asia over the following millennia, clothing was no longer a social signal or a practical comfort. It was the thin line between life and death, quite literally. The groups that had already developed sophisticated clothing technology, fitted, layered, stitched, sealed at the extremities, had a survival advantage so significant it's hard to overstate. A properly constructed garment traps warm air against the body. It protects the wrists and neck, the places where blood runs close to the surface and heat escapes fastest. It allows a human body to survive temperatures that would kill an unclothed person in hours. Those with the needle, the thread, the knowledge of how to prepare hide and layer materials, they made it through. They had children. Those children learned the same skills, and those skills carried forward across generations are part of the reason modern humans made it to every continent on Earth. We didn't just evolve bodies suited for the world, we built a second skin and carried it everywhere we went. There's a transition in the clothing story that often gets glossed over, because it doesn't have a single dramatic moment attached to it. The shift from animal hides to woven plant fibers. Animal hides are warm, durable, and water-resistant. They're also heavy, stiff, difficult to clean, and you need to kill something to get them, which is a logistical constraint. At some point, humans started working with plant fibers, spinning them into thread, twisting them into cord, eventually weaving them into fabric. The oldest known twisted plant fiber was found in a cave in the Republic of Georgia, the country, not the state, and dates to roughly 30,000 years ago. Crucially, those fibers were dyed in multiple colors, already decorative, already intentional, already communicating something beyond simple function. By the time of the Neolithic agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 BCE onwards, textile production had become a core technology of human civilization. Flax cultivation for linen, wool from domesticated sheep. Eventually, cotton, silk, and the extraordinary variety of fibers that different cultures developed independently across the world. And with textiles came something genuinely revolutionary: the wardrobe, clothing that could be specialized for different purposes. A heavy cloak for winter, a light wrap for summer, specific garments for ritual, for work, for status, for mourning. Clothing as a system of expression rather than a single object of survival. The textile industry, long before the Industrial Revolution made it mechanical, was one of the most significant economic and cultural forces in the ancient world. Entire trade routes were built on it. Empires were financed by it. Wars were fought over access to the raw materials for it. Silk alone reshaped the political geography of half the world. All of this from a cold, naked primate with clever hands and a piece of bone. So why did ancient humans start wearing clothes? The honest answer is, for all the reasons, in overlapping waves, driven by biology and culture and climate and social complexity all at once. It probably started with practical protection, something between the skin and the thorns and the sun and the biting things. It evolved almost immediately into social signaling, a way of saying something about who you are in a world full of other people making constant judgments about you. It became a survival technology when the climate turned hostile and the migrations began. And it became an art form, an industry, a language, and an identity as human culture grew more complex. The remarkable thing isn't that we started wearing clothes. Given who we are, social, symbolic, status-obsessed, freezing half the time, it was probably inevitable. You are doing that right now. Whatever you're wearing, you made choices, conscious and unconscious ones, about what to put on your body today. And those choices reflect something about who you are, how you feel, what group you belong to, what image of yourself you're presenting to the world. You are doing exactly what that person on the African savannah was doing, wrapped in ochre-stained hide, figuring out how to signal something about themselves to the people standing around the same fire. 150,000 years of human history, and what connects you to them, directly, without interruption, is the simple fact that you got dressed this morning. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. We get cold, we get creative, we get dressed, and then we spend the rest of our lives complaining that we have nothing to wear. Some things, genuinely, never change. And what about you? Would you go back in time and live completely naked? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon. You're standing around a fire. It's 50,000 BC. The sun just went down. There's no Netflix. There's no phone. There's no existential dread about your inbox. There's just you, the flames, and the thick, choking smoke curling directly into your face. And somewhere at some point, one of your ancestors looked at that smoke and thought, wait, what if I did that on purpose? This is the story of how humans discovered smoking. Not cigarettes, not cigars. Not the guy outside the office who you always end up talking to for too long. We're talking about the very first time a human being intentionally inhaled something burning, and why that might be one of the oldest habits our species has ever had. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Smoking doesn't start with tobacco. It doesn't start with colonial trade routes or Native American ceremonies or even agriculture. The desire to inhale smoke might be hardwired into us on a level so deep, it predates civilization entirely. And the evidence for this is genuinely insane. Let's start with fire. Because before you can smoke anything, you need fire. And fire has been part of the human story for a very, very long time. The oldest confirmed evidence of controlled fire use by our ancestors dates back roughly 1 million years, from a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Archaeologists found burnt plant ash and charred bone. Not the result of a wildfire, but of a sustained, contained fire, used deliberately inside a cave. Now, 1 million years ago, we weren't even Homo sapiens yet. That was Homo erectus, our earlier cousin, with a smaller brain, a heavier brow, and absolutely zero interest in being told what to do with it. They sat around fires just like we do. They cooked, they stayed warm, they huddled together in the dark, and they breathed smoke. Every single day for hundreds of thousands of years, every human and pre-human ancestor who sat near a fire inhaled smoke. It was unavoidable. It was constant. It was basically the original air quality situation, and nobody had an app to check it. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of that smoke wasn't just wood smoke. When you burn organic matter, you don't just get carbon dioxide and water vapor. You get a cocktail of compounds depending on what you're burning. Some plants, when combusted, release psychoactive chemicals, alkaloids, terpenes, compounds that interact with the human nervous system in ways that are, let's say, noticeable. In other words, some of our ancestors were absolutely accidentally getting high around the campfire, and they had no idea why they felt amazing. This isn't a fringe theory. Researchers have proposed for decades that early humans living in forested environments would have regularly been exposed to the smoke of psychoactive plants like cannabis, Nicotiana species, and various entheogens that grow naturally across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The human brain, it turns out, has receptors that respond to cannabinoids. These receptors didn't evolve because of cannabis, they're part of our endocannabinoid system, which regulates everything from mood to memory to appetite. But the fact that they exist means that when a human first inhaled smoke from a burning cannabis plant, their brain wasn't confused. Their brain was like, oh, hello, I've been waiting for you. And that moment, that first accidental hit of psychoactive smoke around a prehistoric campfire, might be the true origin of smoking. Not a decision, not a plan, just a very pleasant accident, repeated enough times that someone eventually thought to recreate it on purpose. Think about that for a second. The entire multi-trillion-dollar global tobacco industry, the centuries of ritual, the shamanic traditions, the medical practices, the social customs, all of it may have started because a tired hunter sat downwind of the wrong bush and had a really unexpectedly great evening. History is sometimes beautiful in the most absurd ways. Now, here's where we have to be careful about timelines, because ancient humans smoked things, and ancient humans intentionally cultivated things to smoke are very different claims. Let's talk about what the archaeology actually tells us. The oldest direct evidence of intentional cannabis use, meaning burned cannabis seeds found in a context suggesting deliberate inhalation, comes from a burial site in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, dating to around 500 BC. Excavators found wooden braziers containing stones that had been superheated, alongside residue from cannabis plants with unusually high THC content. This wasn't wild cannabis used for rope or seeds. This was the good stuff, and it was placed directly in a ritual burial context, 500 BC. That's roughly 2,500 years ago. But here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. Does the absence of older physical evidence mean it didn't happen earlier? Or does it just mean we haven't found it yet? Because organic material, seeds, leaves, plant fiber, almost never survives thousands of years in the ground. We find stone tools from 3 million years ago because stone is basically indestructible. But a wooden pipe filled with dried herbs? That's gone in a few centuries under normal burial conditions. A leather pouch of cannabis? Dissolved back into the earth long before any archaeologist ever showed up with a trowel. So the absence of evidence, in this case, is absolutely not the evidence of absence. There is also the Herodotus problem. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, described in remarkable detail the Scythians, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, performing what he called a vapor bath. They would set up small enclosed tents, heat stones until they glowed, and throw hemp seeds onto those stones, then sit inside the tent inhaling the smoke and, as Herodotus wrote, howling with pleasure. For centuries, historians assumed he was exaggerating or misunderstanding what he saw. Then archaeologists started excavating Scythian burial mounds and finding, you guessed it, bronze braziers, heated stones, and hemp residue, exactly what Herodotus described. The man was just reporting what he saw. He wasn't embellishing. He was, if anything, underselling it. Let's talk about tobacco because it's the one most people actually associate with smoking. Tobacco is a plant in the genus Nicotiana, and it's native to the Americas. That matters enormously because it means tobacco was completely unknown to Old World civilizations, Europe, Africa, Asia, until contact with the Americas in the late 15th century. When European explorers arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, they immediately noticed indigenous people doing something strange. Columbus himself wrote in his journal about seeing men and women walking around with small glowing sticks, inhaling the smoke from burning dried leaves, and letting it back out through their noses and mouths. His crew was baffled. His crew also, within weeks, tried it themselves. Because of course they did. But tobacco use in the Americas is far, far older than 1492. Archaeological evidence of tobacco, specifically chemical residues in ancient pipes, has been found dating back to at least 3,500 years ago in the southeastern United States. Some researchers believe it could go back considerably further, possibly 10,000 years or more, tied to the development of cultivation in the Amazon basin. And here's the thing about tobacco in ancient America. It was not recreational. Not primarily. It was sacred. Tobacco was used in healing rituals, in communication with the spirit world, in binding agreements between tribes. Blowing smoke on someone was an act of blessing, of connection, of respect. A shaman who smoked wasn't having a casual cigarette break. He was opening a channel between the living and the divine. The smoke itself was considered a living carrier, a messenger that traveled between worlds, carrying prayers upward and bringing visions downward. That framing matters. It explains why tobacco use was so disciplined, so ritualized, so controlled in many indigenous cultures for thousands of years. When something is sacred, you treat it with reverence. You don't chain smoke it while watching TV. The idea of tobacco as a casual everyday habit, something you do on a lunch break or while waiting for the bus, is an almost entirely European invention, and a fairly recent one at that. Now, let's go back even further, because there's a piece of this story that most people have never heard, and it might be the oldest evidence of intentional smoking in the entire archaeological record. In 2019, researchers made a remarkable discovery at a site in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. They found a hearth, a cooking and heating fire, roughly 12,000 years old, containing the seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species native to North America. These weren't seeds that had accidentally blown into the fire. They were concentrated, present in a way that suggested deliberate placement. The site predates any known pottery or pipe artifacts in the region by thousands of years. This pushed back the possible timeline of tobacco use in the Americas by a significant margin. And it raised a genuinely fascinating question. If people were throwing tobacco into fires 12,000 years ago, whether to inhale the smoke or for ritual purposes or both, what were people in other parts of the world doing with their local psychoactive plants at the same time? Because 12,000 years ago, humans were everywhere. They were in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in Australia. And the human desire to alter consciousness, to seek out altered mental states, that is not an American phenomenon. That is a human phenomenon. Let me throw something at you that might sound wild, but is taken seriously by respected anthropologists, the intoxication hypothesis. The basic argument goes like this. Across virtually every human culture ever documented, people have sought out ways to alter their consciousness. They've drunk fermented beverages, eaten psychedelic mushrooms, inhaled smoke, chewed plant leaves, and swallowed seeds. This behavior is so universal, so persistent, and so independent across cultures that some researchers believe it isn't accidental. Ronald Siegel, a psychopharmacologist at UCLA, proposed in the 1980s that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth drive, alongside hunger, thirst, and sex, that is biologically embedded in animal behavior, not just human behavior. Elephants deliberately seek out fermented marula fruit. Reindeer in Siberia have been observed eating Amanita muscaria mushrooms and then drinking the urine of other reindeer who ate the mushrooms, because the psychoactive compounds pass through intact. Reindeer. Doing drug recycling. In Siberia. Honestly, respect. The point is, if the drive to alter consciousness is this deep and this old, it's entirely reasonable to propose that early humans, long before they domesticated any plant, long before they had pottery or pipes or any of the tools we normally associate with smoking, were deliberately exposing themselves to smoke from psychoactive plants because they had learned through experience that it changed something in their mind. Maybe they burned those plants intentionally during rituals. Maybe they selected campsites near specific plants for exactly this reason. Maybe they learned which smoke made you feel good and which made you feel like you were dying, which, with some plants, is a distinction that kills you once before you figure it out. This is trial and error, prehistoric style. Very high stakes, occasionally literally fatal. But the ones who survived? They remembered. They told others. They passed it down through generations of knowledge that never got written, but got lived. That's how most human knowledge worked for most of human history. Not libraries, not schools. Lived experience, passed mouth to ear, around a fire, in the dark. Let's also talk about something that rarely comes up in this conversation. Smoking as medicine. Long before smoking was recreational, long before it was spiritual, it may have been medical. The Aber's Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical documents in the world, dates to ancient Egypt around 1550 BC. It describes treatments involving the inhalation of smoke from heated herbs, specifically for conditions affecting the throat and lungs. This is wildly counterintuitive from a modern perspective. You're telling me the ancient Egyptians treated lung problems by inhaling smoke? Yes. Yes, they were. And while that seems insane, it's worth noting that the specific herbs they used, including henbane and various aromatics, do have genuine pharmacological properties when inhaled. The ancient Greeks used fumigation, therapeutic smoke, regularly. Hippocrates, the guy you take an oath named after if you become a doctor, wrote about the inhalation of herbal vapors to treat diseases of the lungs and other conditions. The thinking wasn't crazy by the standards of the time. Smoke reaches the lungs directly, so if the plant has medicinal properties, delivering it via smoke makes a certain logical sense. The lungs as a delivery mechanism. Inhaled medicine. We still do this today. With asthma inhalers and anesthetic gases and nebulizers, the delivery method survived. The burning part, thankfully, mostly didn't. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine, dating back over 3,000 years, describes a practice called dhumapana, literally smoke drinking, involving the inhalation of medicinal herbs through pipes. The texts describe specific plants, specific conditions, specific preparations. This wasn't casual or improvised. It was a sophisticated medical system with detailed protocols and centuries of refinement behind it. Across ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, ancient India, in virtually every early civilization on record, there is evidence of people inhaling smoke deliberately for therapeutic purposes, as a recognized medical practice. Not because they were addicted, not because they thought it was cool, because it worked, or at least it worked sometimes. Or at least it worked enough times that they kept doing it. And in a world without antibiotics, without surgery, without any of the tools modern medicine takes for granted, works sometimes was a pretty meaningful bar to clear. There's another angle to this story that doesn't get enough attention, and it has to do with social bonding. Humans are deeply social animals. We evolved in groups and group cohesion. The ability of a group to stay together, trust each other, act in coordination, was literally a matter of life and death for most of our evolutionary history. Isolated individuals died. Groups survived. Anything that enhanced social bonding had genuine survival value. And shared rituals, including shared consumption of psychoactive substances, are extraordinarily powerful tools for social cohesion. When a group of people undergo a shared altered experience together, it creates a sense of connection, of trust, of mutual understanding that is very hard to replicate any other way. Modern neuroscience has confirmed this. Shared rituals synchronize neural activity, increase trust, and deepen group identity in measurable, documented ways. So when a group of ancient humans sat together in a closed space, breathing in smoke from burning cannabis or other herbs, and collectively entered an altered state, that wasn't just recreational. That was social technology. That was how you built the kind of deep trust and group cohesion that let you go into dangerous situations together and come back alive. The ritual smoke circle wasn't just a party, it was infrastructure. Here's where we arrive at the uncomfortable part of the story. The transition from sacred smoke to casual habit is, historically, an absolute disaster. When tobacco arrived in Europe in the 16th century, it spread with a speed that should remind you of something. Within decades, smoking had gone from an exotic curiosity to a continental obsession. By the 1600s, tobacco was being traded globally. By the 1700s, snuff, powdered tobacco inhaled through the nose, was fashionable across European aristocracy. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. By the early 1900s, the industrially manufactured cigarette had been invented, making tobacco consumption cheaper, more convenient, and more addictive than anything that had come before. What had taken indigenous Americans thousands of years to incorporate into a measured, ritualistic, deeply cultural practice was, in the hands of European industrialists, turned into a mass-market consumer product within 4 centuries. The tobacco industry in the 20th century then spent decades and billions of dollars suppressing the evidence that cigarettes caused cancer. Evidence their own scientists had compiled internally. They marketed cigarettes to children. They hired doctors to endorse their products. They added chemical compounds specifically to make nicotine hit faster and harder, and leave the system more quickly, maximizing addiction. They turned something ancient and ritualistic and communal into a product specifically engineered to be as physically destructive and as financially extractive as possible. A shaman and a tobacco executive both worked with the same plant. They had almost nothing else in common. The gap between a shaman in 500 BC placing cannabis on hot stones in a ritual burial and a tobacco company executive in 1960 signing off on marketing cigarettes to teenagers is one of the larger moral chasms in human history. Both involve smoke. Almost nothing else is the same. So when did ancient humans start smoking? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly. And we probably never will. The physical evidence takes us back 12,000 years with some confidence, and possibly much further with reasonable speculation. The behavioral drive that underlies smoking, the desire to alter consciousness, to share ritual experiences, to use inhaled substances as medicine, is almost certainly far older than any artifact we've found. It may be as old as fire itself. It may be as old as the cognitive leap that made us human in the first place. The ability to connect cause and effect, to look at a burning plant and think, last time that happened, I felt different. Let me do that again. That's not addiction. That's intelligence. What we do know is this: the behavior is extraordinarily old. It predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates every civilization you've ever learned about in school. What is absolutely clear is that by the time the historical record begins, in every corner of the world where humans lived, they were already finding ways to put smoke into their bodies. The specific plants changed. The rituals changed. The purposes changed. But the behavior was already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. There's something almost poetic about that. For all the things that separate modern humans from our ancestors, the technology, the medicine, the internet, the truly baffling amount of content we consume every day, there are these thin threads of continuity that run unbroken through 100,000 years of human experience. Fire, smoke, breath. The oldest humans sat around fires and breathed the same smoky air you'd smell at a bonfire tonight. Some of them, at some point, started paying attention to what that smoke was doing to them. And then they started choosing it, and then they started passing that choice down to their children and their children's children, and eventually to the Scythians howling with pleasure in their tents, and the Egyptian physicians prescribing henbane, and the Mayan shamans reading visions in the rising smoke, and the Taino people on a Caribbean beach watching confused Europeans try tobacco for the first time and cough until their eyes watered. Either way, next time you flip a light switch or sit around a summer fire or catch a whiff of wood smoke on a cold night, you're participating in something far older than you realize. You're doing what humans have always done. You're breathing,